In today's video, I'm going to be talking about why Protestantism, and more specifically the doctrine of Sola Scriptura, is self-defeating. Now, Protestantism is a very wide field. However, Sola Scriptura is something shared across most, if not all, denominations, and can be seen as one of the reasons why I, as a Protestant, after going to Oxford and my kind of intellectual and theological development, has decided to convert to Catholicism. So, first of all, let us start off with talking about what Sola Scriptura is, because Sola Scriptura is often misrepresented by a lot of Protestants, and also Catholics, to say there are no other helpful authorities beyond scriptures. That is not what anyone is rigorously trying to say. They're not saying, well, all right, let's disregard all the people trying to develop upon the scriptures, trying to learn from the scriptures and express the scriptures in a clearer way. They're not saying there is no other authority. But what they are saying is these three things. First of all information necessary for salvation is found in scripture. Everything that we need to know to be saved is found within scripture. The scriptures are the only source of infallible knowledge, from which it follows there are no other infallible authorities outside the scriptures themselves. Most people would agree with number one. Even Catholics would often say the information necessary for salvation is found within scriptures. Of course, the sacramental life and tradition and belief in the Holy One True Apostolic Church does develop from interpretations of scripture, but nonetheless that is found within scripture. So there isn't really much debate about number one. Of course, the way it's formulated can lead to further discussions and disagreements. However, the area which I want to argue is indeed self-defeating, as I say here, is indeed between 2 and 3, especially when we consider the way in which scripture has been developed. Now, why do I say this? Why does propositions 2 and 3 lead to such an internal inconsistency? Why is it self-defeating? Well, that comes from our understanding of the development of scriptures. And this is a development of what I've said in my previous video about, well, why did I become a Catholic, which I'll put in the card above at the end of this video. Why is it important that we understand these two things are inconsistent? Well, the first thing we need to understand is how scriptures were put together. Firstly, if you look at this, a way to say this is not internally inconsistent is to say, well, the scriptures just exist. For example, you think about Mohammedans who say, well, all right, Muhammad got together a Bible, God told him, or the Quran, God told him exactly what to write, he wrote everything down, that's the scriptures, that's just how the scriptures came to be. This will not be internally inconsistent, because if we know exactly that there's been one scripture which was put together by one person, divinely inspired by God, a book just given down from God to us, well, that direct source of knowledge, as we see in the Islamic tradition, would not lead to internal inconsistency. If we said, all right, this book is infallible, this is all we need, and that's it, there are no other infallible authorities, that is not a problem. That is not internally inconsistent. The problem, however, arises when we say, well, actually, the scriptures are not developed in that way. We did not get the 66 books or the 73 books in the Catholic canon, or even more, I think it's 81 in the Orthodox canon. We didn't get these books by just God telling us, okay, this is the book. A book descends down from heaven like the 10 Commandments and shows up with someone in history. Rather, the scriptures were developed over time throughout the Judaic religion, developed through into the kind of the Roman world, and developed from then on. Loads of people are writing, developed further into the modern day. Scripture is something which was written slowly over the millennium. People started compiling them together. People had these books. They put them together first into the Torah. That was the first kind of canon that people recognized, universally recognized within the Jewish tradition. The first 5 books, there's a Pentateuch of Genesis, Deuteronomy, Leviticus, Exodus, and my mind's frozen, Numbers. So you had those 5 books, and they added the prophets and whatnot. You get the Old Testament, then you translate this into the Septuagint, which then adds a few more books in there for the Greek translation of the Old Hebrew. And then after that, you have the New Testament canon, which is agreed upon by most churches. And in fact, most churches, I'd probably say all churches. But at the same time, there's questions of, well, okay, which gospel should go in? Is it the Gospel of Thomas? Should that be going into the scriptures? These things were debated, and slowly we got the New Testament canon. So as we can see, now, of course, it's a broad summary of how scripture was put together, but we can see that scripture was put together over time. People came together and said, okay, this should be the canon. These texts, these apocryphal texts, are not part of the canon because they're either heretical, they have some problems within them, and they're not divinely inspired. So a mix of these three things would lead some people to disregard certain books which are not divinely inspired. Now, okay, given this understanding of how Scripture developed, how can we make an argument for the fact that Sola Scriptura is self-defeating? Well, let's look at these three propositions, but more particularly Proposition 2 and Proposition 3. The Scriptures are the only source of infallible knowledge, and number 3, there are no other infallible authorities. Well, the question arises is, well, we can make a very simple proposition. We can say, well, if the canon of Scripture develops over time, which we know it does, everyone would agree with that historically, there must be an extra scriptural source for its development, because since we don't have a canon written within Scripture to say, well, all right, these are the books that we need to be in Scripture when it's written in 2 Timothy, all Scripture is God-breathed, he doesn't then write, okay, and the Scripture is the Old Testament, and then the New Testament canon, because at that time the New Testament canon did not exist, it was still going around. We have to remember by saying, well, all right, there is an extra scriptural source which develops the Scripture and the canon of Scripture. But now if we accept that, which is relatively uncontroversial, it is by definition true, well, then it follows that, or at least someone can then suggest, well, that the authority which put together an infallible canon must itself have the capacity to act occasionally in an infallible manner. What do I say by this? If I can put together a book which is infallible, surely the person who's compiling it together, the editor of that book, it must also be infallible as well. Because otherwise, how would we know that we have the correct canon of Scripture of infallible sources and infallible information? And how do we know that it is not infallible? How do we know that these things are right, these things are wrong? And how do we know that with infallible certainty? Because otherwise, if the person who put it together was not infallible, then anyone can just say, well, I think that's in the Scriptures, that's not in the Scriptures. Then, well, all right, who actually is a final say on this? You have to have a final authority. Of course, some Protestants would respond to it by saying, well, all right, the way we got canon together is purely because of, okay, this is a set of consistent texts. These things seem to match together. These things do not seem to match together. We can discard them. But on what basis and to what degree can we say, well, okay, these things seem to match together? Because, of course, people who interact with atheists will always be able to recognize the atheists love saying, oh, this part of the Scripture is inconsistent with this part of the Scripture. Oh, Genesis 1 is inconsistent with Genesis 2. Well, to what degree of that inconsistency can we allow before we say, okay, let's get rid of Genesis 2 out of the Bible. Let's get rid of Genesis 1 out of the Bible. Oh, there seems to be a difference in numbers. Let's get rid of that verse. Let's not get rid of that verse. To what extent can we use this consistency argument to develop an infallible Scriptures before we actually just have a complete kind of mess of just personal interpretation and personal establishments of scriptural principles? Rather, it's very important for us as Christians to say, well, actually, no, that's wrong. We have to say there is one infallible authority, at least which can interact occasionally at times which are infallible, to carry out an infallible decision, so that there is one tradition which is extra canonical, extra scriptural, to say, well, all right, this is the infallible doctrine. This is infallible presentation of the canon. But now if we grant that, then we realize that this is internally inconsistent. If we've started from the fact that the Scriptures are the only source of infallible knowledge, but the definition of Scriptures itself demonstrates that it is required to have another infallible authority, then it then goes on to follow that this is internally inconsistent, because then you'll have the four propositions which are proven from these propositions available. You'll have all information necessary for salvation is found within Scripture. Number 2, the Scriptures are the only source of infallible knowledge. Number 3, in order for the Scriptures to be the source of infallible knowledge, there must be a non-scriptural authority, which is also infallible at times to be able to put it together. Then 3, and then 4, you'll have there are no infallible authorities. You'll have then proposition 3 and proposition 4 of that premise set to be inconsistent. Therefore, there's a good reason to believe that this is internally inconsistent. Now, for people who've listened to this and be like, boy, I do not know how I can present this to a Protestant. This seems very complex. Well, 1, you can watch it back a bit slower, but number 2, I would argue that there's a simplified objection, which is there must be an infallible authority put together an infallible book. Essentially, that is what this argument is. If you accept that there must be an infallible authority to put together an infallible book, then it only follows that there must be an infallible authority beyond the church. That's, well, not beyond the church, but beyond the Scriptures. That is all that I am arguing. That's all that is needed to prove that Sola Scriptura as presented is indeed self-defeating. Now, what are some Protestant responses? Well, a Protestant on one hand can say, well, the biblical canon is self-evident. Apocryphal and non-canonical texts are just clearly heretical and are not divinely inspired. A good example of this is you look at the Gospel of Judas and you're like, what on earth is this? They're talking about all these different non-Christian gods like Sackless and people running around. You're like, well, clearly that is not part of Scripture. That is a later addition by some Gnostic believers in the early church. Well, Yes, some of these non-extra-canonical texts can be seen as non-self-evident. These can be seen as heretical. However, there are also other texts like the Gospel of Thomas, not the infancy Gospel of Thomas, but the Gospel of Thomas proper, which most scholarship would say was one of the main sources that Matthew, Mark, and Luke used. Now, you also have kind of the Book of Enoch, which is not in the canon, but people could say, well, hold up a second, that seems to have somewhat of a vigorous kind of supernatural explanation of how the world works. There are also other texts which go around where you're like, well, is this really borderline within the scriptures? Is this divinely inspired? We really don't know. And also a good example of this would be, well, you look at the Catholic book, you look at a Protestant Bible, in both of them they'll have different canons. Maccabees, for example, is not in the Protestant canon. Should those be considered canonical? Should those be considered divinely inspired? Well, yes, or maybe no, it's not exactly clear. And the problem is that since it's not exactly clear what should go in the scriptures and what should go beyond the scriptures, apart from some extreme examples, well, then clearly the biblical canon is not self-evident and clear enough to say, well, all right, we have a very good reason to believe this is the canon and that's it. We cannot make it with that certain assumption or that level of certainty, and therefore it would be incorrect to say, well, we do not need an infallible source because it's just not clear enough. It's not like 1 + 1 = 2. We don't need the Bible to tell us that. This is way more controversial and way more nuanced to say, well, okay, this is not just completely self-evident. And a second objection that a Protestant might raise is, well, scripture is just divinely inspired and therefore it's fully reliable. We can all agree on that, and therefore we don't need this infallible authority. Well, but that just kind of misses the point of the argument. None of us, the Catholics or the Protestants, are disagreeing with the fact that scripture is divinely inspired and that it is infallible. But rather, what we do disagree upon is, well, who has authority to put it together? The very fact that there must be an infallible authority to put together an infallible book and to edit the infallible and compile the infallible book is a fundamental reason to say, well, actually, we do need an extra biblical source of divinely inspired authority. It's not to say that this divinely inspired authority is right all the time, but rather that at certain circumstances, for example, the creation of scripture, it was indeed infallibly designed and infallibly presented. Therefore, this objection that scripture is divinely infallible and that's good enough for us to kind of carry on a discussion kind of misses the point of the objection in this video. So I hope you've enjoyed this video where we demonstrated why Protestantism is self-defeating. I hope you've learned something. If you have any thoughts, objections, ideas, let me know in the comments below. Do you agree with my argument? Do you disagree with my argument? I'd love to hear your thoughts there. Stay safe and I'll see you soon in our next video. God bless.